Before Dr. Matthews could react, the door to the room burst open, and a group of security personnel rushed in. But they didn't come to his aid. They were looking at him, confused and uncertain. One of the guards spoke, his voice strained. "Dr. Matthews, there's something we need to show you. You need to come with us." James's voice echoed once more, this time almost as if it were coming from the walls themselves. "It's too late for that, doctor. You should have seen it coming." Dr. Matthews, still shaken, followed the guards out into the hallway, his mind racing. What could be so urgent that it would draw his attention away from James? As they moved down the corridor, one of the security officers handed him another tablet. This one displayed a video feed of the hospital's security cameras. What Dr. Matthews saw on the screen made his stomach drop. There on the footage was James, only it wasn't the man standing in front of him now. The man in the footage was younger, thinner, and disturbingly familiar. It was the doctor himself, the real Dr. Matthews. James had not only orchestrated the entire scenario, he had replaced Dr. Matthews with an imposter. The life Matthews thought he had been living, the people he thought he had helped, had all been part of an elaborate scheme to make him question everything he had known. The final twist, the one he never saw coming, hit him like a freight train. Dr. Matthews wasn't the one who had been in control all along. The entire time, he had been a pawn in someone else's game. Dr. Matthews' world crumbled as he stared at the footage. The face on the screen was his own, young, unscarred, and vibrant, but not the man he had become. His reflection now felt like a distant stranger, someone he had left behind in the rush of his career. The truth was hard to accept. The person he had trusted, the doctor who had worked tirelessly, had been replaced by a carefully constructed imposter. It was a chilling realization that the life he had lived for years was a carefully orchestrated delusion, a trap set by James. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Dr. Matthews struggled to process the magnitude of the betrayal. James had orchestrated everything: the patient in the hospital bed, the cryptic messages, the fake trauma. It was all a setup, designed to break him down, to make him question his own identity. The man standing before him, the one who had been playing this twisted game, was the true mastermind behind it all. Why? Dr. Matthews finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "What did you want from me? Why destroy my life?" James's cold smile never wavered. "I didn't destroy your life, doctor. I exposed it. You were so caught up in your sense of superiority, in your belief that you controlled everything. I wanted to show you what it feels like to be powerless, to have your world slip away without warning. The difference between you and me. I had nothing to lose. You had everything." Dr. Matthews' chest tightened. The weight of his own arrogance, his dismissive attitude toward people like James, had led him to this moment. He had been so focused on his role as a healer, as someone who held life and death in his hands, that he had lost sight of the truth. Everyone was vulnerable, even him. He had become blinded by his power, thinking he was untouchable. But now, standing in this cold hospital hallway, he knew that the lesson James had taught him was one he would never forget. The world was unpredictable, and no one was immune to its cruelty. With a deep breath, Dr. Matthews turned away from James, the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. He could never undo the damage he had caused, but perhaps just maybe he could start over. He had been given a rare chance, a chance to rebuild, to learn humility, to understand that no one, not even a doctor, was beyond the consequences of their choices. As he walked down the hospital hallway, the noise of the chaotic world around him faded, leaving only the quiet echo of his footsteps. The life he had known was gone, but the future, unwritten, uncertain, lay ahead of him, waiting for him to rewrite it. The lesson had been harsh, but it was one that would shape him for the rest of his life. And as the door to the hospital swung open, Dr. Matthews stepped into a new chapter, one where he would never forget that power, in the end, was fleeting, and redemption often began with the hardest lessons of all. But before she could answer, the sound of screeching tires filled the air, and Maya's head whipped around. Daniel's hand instinctively went to his holster. Something was happening, and they were out of time. The screeching tires echoed in the street, and Maya flinched, her small frame trembling as she instinctively moved closer to Officer Daniels. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder, scanning the area for the source of the noise. A dark sedan had come to a halt just down the block, its windows tinted so heavily that it was impossible to see inside. Daniel's instincts kicked in. Something about the car felt off, and his hand hovered over his holster as he stepped slightly in front of Maya. "Stay behind me," he said firmly, his voice low but steady. Maya nodded, her face pale, her wide eyes locked on the vehicle. It didn't move, but the tension it brought was almost suffocating. Daniel's radio crackled again, the voice on the other end announcing that backup was minutes away. Minutes felt like hours in a situation like this. Daniels crouched slightly, trying to shield Maya as he whispered, "Maya, is that them? Do you know who's in the car?" Her eyes darted between the sedan and Daniels, and then she nodded slowly. They followed me. They don't want me to talk." Her voice cracked, and tears began welling up in her eyes. "Please don't let them take me back." Daniels felt a jolt of anger and determination. Whoever these people were, they had clearly terrified this child to her core. He couldn't let her fall back into their hands. "No one's taking you," he said firmly. But the weight of her words hung heavy. These weren't just random people. They had a reason to chase her down. And whatever Maya knew, it was enough to put her life in danger. The car's engine rumbled softly, still idling in place. Daniels kept his eyes locked on it, his mind racing with possibilities. Were they armed? Were they waiting for a moment to grab her? He didn't have enough information, and that made every second feel more precarious. Maya tugged lightly on his sleeve, pulling him out of his thoughts. "It's not just me," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but the weight of her words hit hard. "There are others. Kids. Like me. They're still there. I got away, but they didn't." Daniel's heart sank. This wasn't just about protecting Maya anymore. This was something bigger, something darker. Whoever was in that car wasn't just after one runaway girl. They were part of something much more sinister, and if Maya was telling the truth, there were other kids still trapped, waiting for someone to save them. As Daniels opened his mouth to ask another question, the sedan's engine roared, and the car suddenly sped off. He instinctively reached for his radio, calling out a description of the vehicle to dispatch. Dark sedan, tinted windows, heading east on Jefferson. Suspected involvement in child endangerment. Keep eyes on it. Maya clung to him, her breathing shaky. "They're going to come back," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "They always come back." Daniels knew she was right. Whoever they were, they wouldn't stop. And now the clock was ticking to uncover the truth, find the other children, and stop this before it was too late. The seconds after the sedan disappeared felt like an eternity. Maya was trembling, clutching her backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. Daniels knelt beside her, his voice low but steady. "Maya, listen to me. We're going to protect you. But I need to know everything. Who are they? What's happening to the other kids?" Maya hesitated, her lip quivering as she glanced up at him. Her eyes were filled with a mix of fear and desperation, and for a moment, it seemed like she might shut down completely. But then she took a deep breath. "They take kids," she whispered, barely audible. They say they're helping us, giving us a place to live, but it's not true. They make us do things. Bad things. And if we don't listen. Her voice broke, and she looked away, tears streaming down her face. Daniel's jaw tightened as the weight of her words sank in. This wasn't just a runaway case or a random abduction. This was organized, deliberate, and dangerous. Where are they keeping the others? He asked, his tone gentle but urgent. Do you know where they are? Maya wiped her face with the back of her hand, nodding slightly. An old warehouse, she said. It's by the river. They move us around, but I heard them talking last time. Some of the kids are still there. I had to leave. I couldn't stay anymore. I couldn't. Daniels felt a surge of urgency. This wasn't just about keeping Maya safe. It was about stopping whoever was behind this and saving the others before it was too late. He grabbed his radio again, relaying the information to dispatch. Possible location near the river. Old warehouse. Requesting additional units and support. Maya's eyes widened. You can't just go there, she said, her voice panicked. They'll know. They'll run, or worse. They'll hurt the kids. You have to be careful. Maya's eyes widened. You can't just go there, she said, her voice panicked. They'll know. They'll run, or worse. They'll hurt the kids. You have to be careful. Daniels nodded, his mind racing as he tried to form a plan. The sound of approaching sirens signaled that backup had arrived, and he felt a small sense of relief. But as he looked at Maya, he realized the clock was still ticking. Every second they waited was a second those kids were in danger. Just then, one of the officers stepped out of a patrol car and walked over to Daniels. What's the situation? He asked, his tone serious. Daniels quickly explained, and the officer's expression darkened. We'll need SWAT for something like this, he said. If it's what she says, we can't risk going in unprepared. Daniels nodded, but Maya tugged at his arm again, her voice trembling. You don't understand, she said. They're always watching. If they think something's wrong, they'll leave, and we'll never find them again. Daniels looked into her eyes and saw the raw fear, the urgency. He knew they had to act fast, but how? The set-in could come back at any moment, and the people behind this were clearly dangerous. The stakes couldn't be higher, and Daniels felt the weight of the lives depending on his next move. Before he could respond, another officer's voice crackled over the radio. We've got a report of a suspicious vehicle matching the description heading toward the river. Units are tracking it now. Daniels exchanged a glance with Maya. Her face turned pale, and she clutched his arm tightly. It's them, she whispered. They're going back. Daniels stood, his mind set. We move now, he said to the team around him. Carefully, but we move. As the officers prepared, Maya's gaze stayed fixed on the direction of the river, her fear palpable. Whatever lay ahead, Daniels knew they were heading straight into the heart of something dark, and there was no turning back. The convoy of patrol cars moved swiftly but carefully, their lights flashing without sirens to avoid drawing attention. Maya sat in the back seat of Daniel's car, clutching her backpack like it was a lifeline. Her face was pale, her breathing uneven, and Daniels could see the fear gripping her. He wanted to reassure her, to promise her it would all be okay. But the truth was, he didn't know what they were walking into. The warehouse by the river could be empty, or it could be a trap. Either way, time was running out. As they neared the location, the quiet hum of the radio was interrupted by an urgent report from one of the trailing units. We spotted the set-in parked near the east entrance of the warehouse. No movement inside the vehicle yet, but the area looks active. There's another van parked out back, unmarked. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. An unmarked van meant trouble. It likely wasn't there by accident. Maya's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, they move us around asterisk. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her staring out the window, her small hands trembling. Maya, he said gently, do you recognize the van? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. That's how they take us, she whispered. That's how they keep us hidden. Daniels felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He grabbed his radio. All units proceed with extreme caution. Suspected active transport vehicle on site. Keep eyes on both entrances. As they pulled closer, the tension in the air was suffocating. Officers spread out, taking positions around the warehouse, waiting for the green light to move in. Daniels turned to Maya, his voice calm but firm. Maya, you've been brave so far. Is there anything else you can tell me? Anything that might help us? Her eyes filled with tears as she struggled to find the words. There's a basement, she finally said. That's where they keep the kids. But there's a back way in. They always use it when they think someone's coming. Daniel's heart sank. A back exit could mean the difference between saving those kids and losing them forever. He relayed the information to the team, and the plan shifted immediately. They'd have to split their forces, covering both the main entrance and the back exit to ensure no one slipped through. Just as the officers were finalizing their positions, one of the spotters near the east entrance radioed in, his voice tight with urgency. Movement inside. 2 figures heading toward the van. Looks like they're carrying something or someone. Just as the officers were finalizing their positions, one of the spotters near the east entrance radioed in, his voice tight with urgency. Movement inside. 2 figures heading toward the van. Looks like they're carrying something or someone. Daniels froze for a moment before snapping into action. Hold positions. Wait for my signal. He turned to Maya. Stay here. Lock the doors and don't move. She nodded, though her eyes were wide with panic. But as Daniel stepped out of the car, something unexpected happened. The sedan they had spotted earlier suddenly roared to life. Tires screeched as it peeled out of its parking spot, speeding straight toward one of the patrol units. Officers shouted, scrambling to avoid the vehicle, and in the chaos, Daniels caught sight of a figure slipping out of the warehouse's side door, disappearing into the shadows. The scene was unraveling quickly, and Daniels realized this wasn't just an attempt to move the kids. It was a distraction. Whoever was behind this had planned for interference, and now they were trying to cover their tracks. He radioed the team. We've got a runner. East side heading toward the docks. Units pursue the sedan. Everyone else secure the building. He didn't wait for confirmation before taking off toward the side door. The figure had a head start, but Daniels wasn't about to let them get away. He could hear the chaos behind him. Officers shouting, the screech of tires, and the faint sound of Maya crying out his name. But there was no time to turn back. Whoever had just fled that warehouse knew exactly what was happening inside, and they were the key to uncovering the full extent of this operation. As Daniels closed the gap, he caught a glimpse of the figure disappearing around a corner. His heart pounded as he sprinted after them, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The stakes were higher than ever, and he could feel it in his gut. This wasn't just about saving the kids. This was about taking down an entire operation. But was he already too late? Daniels pushed himself harder, his breath coming in short gasps as he rounded the corner. The figure ahead was fast, darting between the shadows, but Daniels was determined not to lose them. His footsteps echoed against the cold concrete as he chased them toward the docks. The faint sound of water lapping against the pier mixed with the distant shouts of officers securing the warehouse, but his focus was locked on the person in front of him. Just as Daniels was closing the gap, the figure stumbled, tripping over a loose plank. Daniels lunged forward, grabbing them by the arm and pinning them to the ground. It was a man, his face pale and slick with sweat. He struggled, but Daniels quickly cuffed him, forcing him to his knees. "Who are you?" Daniels demanded, his voice sharp. "What's going on inside that warehouse?" The man didn't respond, his eyes darting nervously toward the water. Daniels followed his gaze and froze. A boat was waiting at the end of the dock, its engine humming softly. On board were two more figures, and between them were large crates. Daniel's heart sank as he realized the crates were likely holding the children Maya had spoken about. This wasn't just a distraction, it was the real escape plan. He radioed his team, urgency in his voice. Suspects fleeing by boat at the docks. Multiple children on board. Need immediate backup. The radio crackled in response, but Daniels couldn't wait. He dragged the man to his feet, securing him to a nearby post before sprinting toward the boat. The men on the boat spotted him and began shouting. One of them reached for something, likely a weapon, and Daniels ducked behind a stack of barrels for cover. The tension was suffocating as he waited for an opening. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Officer Daniels." Maya's voice was small but steady, and she was holding something out to him. It was a radio she had grabbed from the patrol car. "They're calling you. They're sending help." Daniels nodded, his mind racing. He glanced at the boat, calculating the distance. He couldn't wait for backup to arrive. The boat would be gone by then. Summoning all his courage, he darted out from cover, shouting for the men to stop. One of them fired a warning shot into the air, but Daniels didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his weapon drawn, using every ounce of authority in his voice. "Put the kids down and step away from the crates." The men hesitated, exchanging glances. For a moment, it seemed like they might comply, but then the boat's engine roared louder. They weren't giving up without a fight. Daniels took a calculated risk, firing a shot at the engine. The loud crack of the bullet echoed, and the engine sputtered before dying. The boat lurched, and the men lost their balance, scrambling to keep it steady. Backup arrived just in time, officers swarming the dock and surrounding the boat. The men on board surrendered, realizing they were outnumbered. Daniels climbed onto the boat, prying open one of the crates. Inside were frightened, teary-eyed children, their small faces lighting up with a mix of relief and confusion as they realized they were being rescued. But just as Daniels was helping the first child out of the crate, the man he had cuffed earlier let out a loud whistle. Daniels spun around, his heart racing, and saw movement from the shadows near the warehouse. A second vehicle was speeding toward the dock, a last-ditch effort to recover what they had lost. Daniels shouted a warning, and officers immediately blocked the path of the car. The driver tried to reverse, but it was too late. The vehicle was surrounded, and its occupants were dragged out, revealing more members of the operation. Daniels couldn't believe how extensive the network was. This wasn't just a small group. It was a coordinated ring. As the final suspect was secured, Daniels turned back to Maya, who was standing at the edge of the dock, watching everything unfold. She looked at him with wide eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "Did we get them all?" Daniels knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We got them," he said softly. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. This was a victory, but it was only the beginning of unraveling the larger network behind it all. As the night stretched into the early hours of dawn, the scene at the docks began to calm. Officers worked tirelessly, escorting the rescued children to waiting ambulances and reuniting them with tearful social workers. Maya stayed close to Daniels, clutching his sleeve as if afraid to let go. The weight of what had just happened was finally settling in, but she didn't look as scared anymore. There was a spark of hope in her eyes, faint but unmistakable. Daniels watched as the last of the suspects were loaded into patrol cars, their faces a mix of anger and defeat. The warehouse was being searched thoroughly, with officers combing through every inch to uncover more evidence. Daniels knew this wasn't the end of the fight. There would be paperwork, court hearings, and likely more arrests to come. But tonight, at least they had made a difference. Lives had been saved. Maya tugged on his sleeve, pulling him from his thoughts. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. He crouched down to her level, his expression softening. "Now you're safe," he said. "You don't have to be scared anymore. We'll make sure you have a home, a real one, where people care about you." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "And the people who did this. They're not going to hurt anyone else ever again." Her lip quivered, and for a moment, Daniels thought she might cry. But instead, she surprised him. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, crumpled photo. It was of her and another little girl, both smiling, their arms around each other. "This is my sister," Maya said, her voice breaking. "They took her first. I don't know where she is." Daniels felt a lump in his throat. He took the photo gently, examining it. "We'll find her," he promised. "I won't stop until we do." Maya nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She finally looked like a child again, no longer weighed down by fear. Daniel stood, tucking the photo into his pocket. As the sun began to rise over the city, casting a soft golden light over the docks, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just another case. This was about giving kids like Maya a chance to feel safe, to reclaim their lives. As he walked her toward one of the waiting cars, Daniels couldn't help but glance back at the warehouse one last time. It was just a building now, empty and lifeless. But for too long, it had been a place of suffering. Now it marked the beginning of something new, a chance to bring justice and hope to those who needed it most. Maya climbed into the car, looking back at Daniels with a faint smile. He nodded at her, silently promising to keep his word. And as the car drove off, he stood there for a moment, the weight of the night lifting just slightly. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Still, it was a start. And sometimes that's all you need to change everything.